The cops didn't expect me to open the front door. "Sir, we got a call from the homeowner," the officer started, confused. "Yeah," I said, stepping aside, "you're looking at him." "I'm Daxon Zimmerman. I own the biggest house on Alder Grove Lane. Paid for it in cash after selling my tech startup last year. I left for a business retreat in Switzerland 3 weeks ago. Told no one except my lawyer and my housekeeper, who stops by twice a week to water the plants and make sure nobody's tried anything stupid. Apparently, that wasn't enough. When I landed early and got back to the house last night, something felt off. My front gate code had been changed. There was a blue sedan parked in the driveway, definitely not mine. I used the spare key hidden in the utility box and walked into what looked like someone else's life. Candles. Wine glasses. A yoga mat in the living room, and then I heard it. "Derek, did you get the almond milk?" Or she froze when she saw me, middle-aged, blonde bob, wearing one of my bathrobes. It was Zelda Norrington, HOA president. The same woman who fined me $200 last month for excessive mailbox design. "Why are you in my house?" I asked, calm but sharp. "You're not supposed to be home yet," she blurted. That's when she ran upstairs and locked herself in the master bedroom. 10 minutes later, the cops were at my door. "She said you were trespassing," one of them said. "Well," I said, pulling out my ID and property deed from my backpack, "she's going to have a real hard time proving that." The officers looked at each other. "Mind if we check the property?" "Please do." They found her upstairs, stuffing jewelry into a tote bag, my jewelry. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, standing in my closet like she belonged there. "I was told the property had been abandoned due to foreclosure. As HOA president, I had the right to secure it." "Foreclosure?" I raised an eyebrow. "You think the guy who paid in full abandoned his mansion after 3 weeks?" "I'll speak to my attorney," she snapped. "Please do. I'd love to hear what he thinks of breaking and entering." She got cuffed right there, muttering some nonsense about community preservation. But I knew this wasn't just some random Karen power trip. This was bigger. Because when I checked the security footage from the gate camera's footage she didn't know existed, I saw exactly how she got in. 2 weeks ago, Zelda had used a contractor's code to unlock the gate. She marched in with a rolling suitcase, a smug little dog, and a clipboard, and she wasn't alone. She was with 2 other board members from the HOA. This wasn't a one-woman stunt. This was a takeover. Detective Monroe didn't bother knocking. He rang the bell once, waited exactly 6 seconds, then opened the gate with the code I'd given him and walked right up the driveway like it was his. "You were right," he said, stepping over a half-deflated yoga ball that had been left behind in the rush. "We found forged documents on her laptop, deed transfers, utility rerouting forms. All of them filed under a shell LLC the HOA incorporated last month." I shut off the sprinkler system from my phone and looked up at him. "So it's wire fraud. And attempted real estate theft," he added, pulling a worn leather notepad from his jacket. "You ever heard of eminent community claim? Sounds made up." "It is," he said, flipping to a page filled with tight handwriting. Zelda filed a motion with the county clerk's office claiming the HOA had assumed emergency stewardship of properties in neglect or transition. Apparently, they tried it before in another neighborhood over in Langdon Hills. Didn't get this far, though. So they test a scam in a lower income area, and when no one stops them, they bring it here, he nodded slowly. They're targeting absentee owners, people with second homes, military families. Anyone who won't notice until it's too late. I looked out at the quiet cul-de-sac, every house trimmed and watered like a real estate brochure. "How many other places you think they've tried this?" "We're still digging," he said. "But here's the kicker. She wasn't just squatting. She listed the property for short-term corporate leasing, had 2 bookings lined up for next month. That stopped me. So she was going to rent out my house while I was gone. Looks that way. And she's done it before, too. Same LLC signed contracts on 2 other properties. We've already contacted those owners. One's in Germany on a sabbatical. The others an elderly couple in assisted living. They had no idea. I leaned against the porch railing, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. How many people were in on this? We've got 4 confirmed so far. Zelda, 2 board members Alan and Marcy, and a paralegal named Vic who helped draft the legal paperwork. He's not officially part of the HOA, but he's been on retainer for years, used to work with foreclosure firms. And what about the other residents? I asked. Anyone else helping them? Monroe shook his head. Most of the neighbors didn't know a thing. Zelda told them you'd transferred ownership and that she was overseeing renovations, even staged a fake inspection last week. One of the neighbors thought it was odd she had a clipboard with a grocery list on it. I exhaled slowly. What about the money? The bookings, the LLC deposits, any idea where it went? We're tracing it now. Looks like she funneled earnings through a dummy contractor business. Claimed she was remodeling the homes for community resale, which, by the way, violates about 30 different housing codes. I didn't respond right away. Something on the edge of the lawn caught my eye, a small garden gnome half buried under a pile of mulch. I definitely didn't own a garden gnome. I walked over and pulled it out. Inside was a GPS tracker. Looks like they were watching to see if I came back. Monroe walked over, took it from me with a gloved hand and bagged it. This just got federal. He didn't need to explain. Once there's a pattern of interstate fraud, surveillance equipment, and forged documents, it's not just a local matter anymore. Homeland Security gets involved, and that's when the real fun starts. Later that afternoon, I met with my attorney, Leela, in the sunroom, the only place in the house that hadn't been redecorated with top-throw pillows and cheap, motivational wall art. She scrolled through the documents we'd pulled from the HOA's website archive. They've been rewriting the bylaws quietly for months, all under the radar, nothing voted on by members, no public records, just internal memos and backdated signatures. Can we prove those are false? She turned the screen to show me a scanned signature from one of the supposed meetings. This guy moved to Florida in February. He hasn't been to a board meeting since last year. I sat back, the pieces clicking into place. So they used his name to pass the clause allowing emergency property control, and forged at least 3 others, she added. We can get this entire board dissolved, maybe even banned from serving on any HOA again. Good, I said. But what about criminal charges? Can they actually go to prison for this? Oh, they will, she said. Forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy, misuse of fiduciary authority, that's all state and federal. But we're not stopping there. I raised an eyebrow. We file a civil suit on behalf of every homeowner who's paid dues under false pretenses. Every dollar they've spent since those forged bylaws went into effect, we demand it back, with interest. That night, I walked the neighborhood for the first time since I got back. A few folks were out watering their lawns or pulling trash bins to the curb. I didn't say much, I just nodded. But by the time I reached the end of the street, a woman approached. Late 50s, sharp eyes, carried herself like someone who'd spent years keeping things together. You're the guy from the Zimmerman place, right? I nodded. That's me. I heard what happened, we all did. Some of us suspected something was off, but we didn't know how deep it went. I waited. She looked around, then leaned in slightly. They tried to fine me last month for having a disabled nephew over too often, said he was a nuisance presence. I told them to shove it. They threatened legal action. You got a letter, she nodded. Still have it, along with the one where they said they'd cancel my gate access if I didn't comply. Mind if I get a copy, she smiled. Already sent it to your lawyer, along with statements from 5 other neighbors. We're done being quiet. The next morning, Leela filed a cease and desist letter to the remaining board members. Within 24 hours, Alan and Marcy both resigned. Vic, the paralegal, tried to claim he'd been duped, but the email trail buried him. They'd coordinated everything from password changes on gate systems to scheduling fake inspections with a third-party contractor who turned out to be Alan's cousin. And then came the emergency town hall. We rented out a local community center. Over 200 residents showed up, some furious, others just confused. I let Leela handle the legal breakdown and she didn't hold back. Every forged document, every shady transaction, every manipulated clause, she laid it out on a projector with timestamps, signatures, and witness testimonies. When she finished, there was dead silence. Then someone clapped, then more, until the whole room was on their feet. We held an emergency vote that night. Dissolution of the current board passed with 93% approval. A neutral management company was brought in to handle operations until a new board could be fairly elected. Zelda, meanwhile, remained in custody. Her bail was denied after they found she'd attempted to transfer funds to an offshore account the night of her arrest. The feds had already frozen everything. As for me, I replaced every lock, updated the security system, and installed cameras with facial recognition. Not because I was scared, because I wanted them to know they'd never get back in, not here, not ever again. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, just in the way the air seemed to hang heavy between the polished wood paneling and the silence of 30 strangers waiting to see if justice still worked. I sat beside Leela near the front, while Zelda Norrington stood at the defense table in a beige blazer that didn't quite hide the tremble in her hands. Judge Hargrave adjusted his glasses and glanced at the stack of exhibits Leela had submitted earlier that morning. He didn't look impressed. The defendant is charged with criminal trespassing, fraud, identity theft, attempted unlawful property transfer, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, he said, voice even but sharp. I've reviewed the submitted evidence. We'll begin with opening statements. Zelda's attorney, a lean man with a narrow face and a tie too bright for the occasion, rose first. He spoke of confusion, miscommunication, a breakdown in procedural clarity between the HOA and county offices. His entire argument leaned on the premise that Zelda had acted under the impression that she was protecting community property. Leila didn't flinch. When her turn came, she stood without notes. My client, Mr. Zimmerman, owns the property in question outright. There was no foreclosure notice. No abandonment, no legal transfer. The defendant knowingly altered gate access, occupied the home, staged the interior, listed it for private leasing, and coordinated forged documentation with accomplices on the HOA board. This wasn't confusion, it was strategic theft. Hargrave nodded once. Proceed. Over the next 2 hours, the case unfolded in meticulous detail. Leela called witnesses who hadn't spoken publicly before. The locksmith who'd been told he was rekeying a foreclosed property. The IT contractor who'd unknowingly installed network equipment under Marcy's request, while Zelda stood over him with coffee and a fake badge clipped to her sweater. Then came the emails. Hundreds of them, pulled from Vic's seized laptop, threads detailing how they'd timed their activities around residents' travel schedules, instructions for rerouting mail, financial statements showing deposits from short-term rental agencies. But the real bombshell came when Leela called Detective Monroe to the stand. We found a second set of forged documents, he said, adjusting his collar as he addressed the court. This time related to insurance claims. The HOA board filed damage reports on properties that never sustained any damage, then pocketed the reimbursement checks sent from the insurers. Several of those homes belonged to elderly residents who'd been moved into assisted care. One of them passed away last month. Her estate never saw a dime. Gasps echoed from the gallery. Judge Hargrave didn't even call for silence. He just leaned back, fingers steepled. And were those documents signed by the defendant? Yes, Your Honor. Her signature appears on at least 6 separate claim forms, all processed through the HOA's internal insurance liaison. Zelda's attorney tried to object, but Hargrave overruled him before he finished the first syllable. By the time court adjourned for the day, it was clear the defense strategy had collapsed. Zelda was ordered into house confinement pending sentencing. Her attorney requested a lenient bond arrangement, citing emotional strain. Hargrave denied it flatly. Outside the courthouse, news vans had started to circle. I kept my head down and walked to the car with Leela while Monroe stayed behind to speak with federal investigators. More charges were coming. "What's next?" I asked once we were safely away from the crowd. "We file civil suits against the remaining shell companies," Leela said, tapping through her tablet. "We've already traced one account to a property in Arizona. Looks like Alan used HOA funding to put a down payment on a vacation home. And the residents here? They'll get reimbursed, eventually. But it's going to take months to unwind everything. The management companies already found irregularities in the community budget, unapproved landscaping contracts, inflated maintenance charges, even a payment to a catering company that doesn't exist." I stared out the window as we passed through the gates of Alder Grove. The same ones Zelda had walked through with her little rolling suitcase and clipboard, like she owned the place. Now, the keypad had been replaced with a biometric scanner and encrypted entry logs. No one was getting in unless they were supposed to. The next evening, I received a letter. It wasn't from the court. It was handwritten, folded into an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence: they were going to do it again. No name, no explanation. I brought it to Monroe the next morning. He read it twice, then pulled out his phone and called someone without saying a word to me. After a brief exchange, he hung up and nodded. "That confirms what we found last night. They'd already scouted 2 more properties. One of them belonged to a doctor stationed overseas. The others owned by a woman in hospice care. They had draft documents ready to file if you hadn't come back early." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't have to. "They were building a system," I said, not as a question. "A machine," he replied. "One that ran off apathy and paperwork. And they almost got away with it." That afternoon, I walked with a few neighbors through the old HOA office. The management company had opened it up for review. Files were being cataloged. Boxes of shredded documents lined the hallway, some of them still warm from the machines. One of the volunteers found a ledger labeled Community Outreach. It listed the names of residents marked with symbols. A check meant cooperative. A dash meant neutral. And an X. That meant resistant. My name had 3 X's. Marcy's had underlined it with red ink. We held a community summit the following week. Not a meeting, a summit. Every resident was invited. We rented out the school auditorium and set up an open mic. One by one, people came forward. Stories spilled out like floodgates finally opened. A single mother fined for having a trampoline. A retired teacher threatened with litigation for installing a wheelchair ramp without aesthetic review. A man whose autistic son was reported for unauthorized sounds. Each one had paperwork. Each one had dates, signatures, and copies. Together, we compiled everything into a formal archive. We called it the Alder Grove Accountability Report. The county board reviewed it and launched a full audit of every HOA in the district. Within weeks, 2 more associations in nearby neighborhoods were dissolved. One of them had the same paralegal, Vic, listed as a consultant. He was arrested in Nevada trying to board a flight to Belize. 2 months later, Zelda was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. She wept when the verdict was read, but not out of remorse. It was rage, pure and simple. She'd lost control, and that was the one thing she couldn't handle. Her house was repossessed. The funds were used to repay residents. The HOA was officially dissolved. Alder Grove became the first self-managed community in the county, overseen by an elected board of volunteers with full transparency and quarterly audits open to every homeowner. And me, I kept my cameras up. I left the tracker gnome in the yard as a reminder, but I also built something else. A small, locked library box on the edge of the lawn. Inside, I stocked every legal document, every court ruling, every forged form we exposed. Residents could read them anytime. I titled it, "The Cost of Silence," because that's what they had counted on, that no one would speak up. That no one would come home early. The sun burned low over Alder Grove as I parked across from the old HOA storage unit. It had been padlocked for months, its contents boxed up and sealed by the interim management company the day after the board was ousted. But now, with the civil suit gaining momentum and a county audit in full swing, the court granted us supervised access. Leela met me there, clipboard in hand and dressed like she hadn't slept in a week. She nodded to the county clerk standing beside her, then motioned to the locksmith. With a few twists, the door yawned open. Inside, rows of metal filing cabinets and plastic tubs lined the cinderblock walls. A musty smell clung to the air, paper mildew, and something sour beneath it all. I stepped in carefully, flashlight scanning the shelves. "This is where they kept the real records," Leela said, pointing to a cabinet in the back. "Not the polished ones they uploaded to the member portal. These are the raw drafts, meeting minutes that were never approved, financial drafts, internal memos." We got to work, flipping through files and stacking anything marked confidential or internal use only into separate piles. It didn't take long to find something strange. A folder labeled Phase 3 Contingency. Inside were blueprints, not for houses, for a gated expansion development, one that didn't exist. I pulled out a rolled survey map stamped with a county engineer's seal. The name at the bottom caught my breath. Alder Grove East Private Holdings Initiative. "I've never seen this road," I said, tapping the proposed cul-de-sac branching off the southern end of the neighborhood. Leela's brows furrowed. "That's because it doesn't exist." "Not legally. We found a list of addresses, 15 properties marked for reassignment under strategic stewardship. Half had notes beside them: legal heir dispute, non-compliant ownership, international absentee, elderly no digital access. They were drawing up a ghost subdivision," she said quietly. "A whole second neighborhood that only existed on paper." "But why?" She flipped to the last page. "Because they were selling it." There it was. A contract unsigned but prepared with a luxury real estate firm based out of Palm Springs. The LLC listed as the seller. Same one Zelda used when she tried to lease my house. This time they were offering exclusive investor access to pre-market properties in a private enclave. The kicker: the properties weren't real, not yet, but the land, that was county-owned greenbelt, protected, no development allowed. "They were going to sell fake lots on illegal land," I said, stunned. "And then bury the fallout under a shell HOA," Leela added. "If buyers ever complained, they'd claim fraud and dissolve the entity. Blame it on a rogue manager, wash their hands." We called Detective Monroe immediately. He met us 20 minutes later with 2 forensic analysts in tow. Once they confirmed the documents were authentic, he called the district attorney. By nightfall, subpoenas had been issued for the real estate firm, the surveyor, and the notary who'd signed multiple forms. 2 names popped up again and again: Alan and Vic. Turns out, Alan's cousin worked for the county zoning office. A quiet guy with access to land parcel databases, and no idea he'd been manipulated into generating fake preliminary zoning clearances. The next day, the DA held a press conference. The charges against Zelda and her co-conspirators were expanded to include conspiracy to commit large-scale land fraud, misuse of public property through falsified records, and attempted racketeering under the state's organized crime statutes. The press dubbed it the Phantom Subdivision Scheme. It made national headlines, talk shows, investigative specials. A segment ran on a Sunday morning program with drone footage of Alder Grove and interviews with local residents. One of the clips showed the garden gnome I'd left in the yard, now symbolic of the bizarre surveillance tactics the HOA used. Within a week, 3 more arrests were made: 2 former contractors who'd signed off on fictional inspections, and 1 notary who admitted to stamping documents in exchange for free landscaping services. The county revoked every permit linked to the HOA. Frozen accounts were seized. And the real estate firm? They claimed they'd been duped, but leaked emails showed their senior agent had attended one of Zelda's private investment brunches at my house while I was abroad. He was charged too. Meanwhile, the interim management company wrapped up its audit of the neighborhood's finances and presented the findings at a final community forum. We gathered in the school gymnasium again, this time not for a fight, but for closure. A giant spreadsheet was projected on the wall behind the podium. It showed every dollar misused over the last 3 years, over $70,000 in unapproved expenditures, $25,000 in fake fines, $15,000 in unauthorized beautification projects that led nowhere. But here's what mattered. Nearly every cent was being returned. Between asset seizures and restitution agreements, the DA's office had recovered enough to refund every resident who'd been fined, overbilled, or wrongfully assessed under the forged bylaws. Volunteers distributed checks that night. People cried, hugged, laughed in ways that hadn't been heard in Alder Grove for years. Then came the vote, not for a new HOA. For a permanent charter. Alder Grove would be governed by a neighborhood council, a volunteer committee with no enforcement power, just advisory duties, community events, and liaison access to the city. It passed unanimously. I didn't run for the council. I'd done my part. But I did donate the seed money to create a neighborhood legal defense fund. Just in case. Layla, ever the strategist, helped draft a toolkit for other communities' guidelines for how to challenge corrupt HOAs, templates for public record requests, legal loopholes to watch for. We posted it online under a nonprofit banner. Within weeks, it went viral. Communities from across the country reached out, some thanking us, others asking for help. Retired judges, legal students, even a few ex-HOA presidents who'd resigned in protest of their own boards. A movement had started. Quiet, determined, and smarter than the people who tried to control them. As for Zelda, she took a plea deal in exchange for turning over documents that implicated a dozen more individuals in related schemes across the state. She'll serve 8 years in prison, with another 7 on probation. She forfeited her assets and is legally barred from serving on any housing board or real estate committee for the rest of her life. The last time I saw her, she was being led out of the courthouse in a gray jumpsuit, eyes hollow, no clipboard in sight. She didn't look at me, didn't need to. Back in Alder Grove, the air felt different, lighter. Kids played in yards without fear of being reported. Neighbors started potlucks again. One even set up a tiny produce stand on the corner, payment by honor system. I still kept the cameras. The archive box remained out front, now laminated and weatherproofed. People still visited it, especially new homeowners. It became a rite of passage. Read the file. Know the warning. One day, a young couple moved in next door. I stopped by with a welcome basket, nothing fancy, just some good coffee, local honey, and a printed copy of the charter. The husband raised an eyebrow when he saw it. Bit extreme for a neighborhood welcome, he said, half joking. I smiled, then pointed at the laminated box by the sidewalk. Trust me, I said, you'll want to read the prequel.